to another video on History Fight Podcast, and today I'm joined by David Fitzgerald, and today's discussion is going to be based on his book titled Playing God in Evolutionary History of World Religion, and this is the first volume, so I have the link to purchase it in the description below. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, David.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So let's start at the beginning of the timeline, the stuff you're talking about in the book about the evolution of the religion. We'll start with El, the Canaanite god that's also mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, and when we look at the book of Deuteronomy, we see that Yahweh or Adonai inherits Israel from this god.
Right.
And so, who exactly is El? Who appears to be the father of the biblical God.
Right. First of all, I want to say that's not starting at the beginning. That's about halfway through our evolution of religion. But that said, when you talk about Mesopotamian religion and Semitic religions and early Judaism, El, Baal, Yahweh, it gets very hard to tell them apart because El, of course, was the supreme head of the Canaanite religion. And all the various Canaanite peoples worshipped some form of him as the supreme god. But as time goes on, you get Baal, his son. Yahweh can also be considered a son of him, depending on which text you're reading. But the fact of the matter is that they start borrowing from each other's their powers, their spheres of influence, their abilities, and even sometimes their consorts. So their identities are very fluid when it comes to trying to tell them apart. El, Yahweh, Baal. And of course, we had more than one kind of Yahweh too. There was Yahweh of this area, Yahweh of that area. One of the most interesting things that comes out in the book is we have a whole century of writings from a Jewish colony in Egypt at the time of this is about the 5th century BCE, where not only do they worship this form of Yahweh called Yao, but Yao also has a wife, a consort, and there's 3 other gods at least. Some of the other, there may even be more, depending on whether these are just titles of a god or actual names of a god. But we know at least they had 5. And we have the most amazing collection of correspondence, for instance, and court cases and that sort of documentation, where you have Jews talking to other Jews saying things like, "May the gods bless you, my brother." Things we're totally not used to thinking about early Israelite times and Judean times. For instance, this is happening at a time when only the Jerusalem temple is supposed to be the one and only temple, and all the other holy places have been shut down apparently by God-fearing rulers. And yet for 100 years we have this temple that worships again at least 5 gods, including Yahweh. And they're not some mutant spin-off. They're not some land that time forgot sort of situation. They're in close contact and on good terms with the Jewish temple, the temple in Jerusalem. And yet they defer to them in judgments and things like that, but none of the judgments are based on, for instance, Mosaic law. They don't seem to have any connection either in Jerusalem or in Elephantine, this Jewish colony, to any of the books of Moses, any of the story of Abraham, any of the story of Moses and Joshua. None of that seems to be on their plate. In fact, we have a letter to the colony from the Persian governor telling them how to celebrate a new holiday called Passover, and this is how you celebrate it. And his directions for celebrating it are even different from our the ones that have come down to us in the Bible and in ancient Judaism. So there's all kinds of bizarre surprises in this book for things like that. I don't know how many of you or your readers are familiar with my talk on YouTube called Sexy Violence, Violent Sex, the Weird-Ass Morality of the Bible. But I stopped working on the book version of that Sex and Violence in the Bible talk because we've had so many really fascinating breakthroughs in not just archaeology, but in religious studies for early Judaism especially, and for early Islam especially. Just mind-blowing stuff. And yeah, 4 years ago, I would not have known much of the stuff that I wrote about in this. Really mind blowing.
David, can you still hear me? David? Hold on, everyone. It looks like we lost David here. I think there's an issue with the connection. All right, can you hear me?
Are you there?
Yeah, now I can hear you. It froze again for a moment.
Oh dear. Okay, I'm gonna close
Can you hear me?
Facebook. I can hear you. I can hear you and can see you. So where did you lose me?
Okay. It was a little bit after you were talking about 5 gods. It was
Okay.
somewhere
Oh my
around
goodness.
there.
Oh my goodness. I think you lost about 3 minutes of me talking. No. So
No, it was a little, like I said, it was a little after, but it was a little after
Gotcha.
that. But that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Gotcha. Well, I apologize for the technical glitches we're having today. I'll try to get that
No,
fixed
that's
for
fine.
next time. Anyway, so yeah, in a nutshell, we've got some really interesting bombshells about not just early Judaism, but early Islam that have come out in the last 2 or 3 years, which prompted me to stop working on the sex and violence in the Bible book and start working on playing God. And I'm very excited about it. I'm as jazzed about this as I was when I wrote Nailed and Jesus Mything in Action back in the day. And it's been really interesting journey how all these books have built on each other. Nailed just pointed out the top 10 ways that the official story of Christianity doesn't hold up, whether there was a Jesus or not, and making arguments why it looks like there wasn't a Jesus. Jesus Mything in Action went into deep dives into our Gospels and the rest of the New Testament and in early Christianity. And this book, Playing God, talks about the evolution of all the religions, at least all the religions, full stop, and the biographies of the top 10 major world religions that we have today, and the evolution of monotheism. And it makes the argument that, it's not just Jesus. When we look at all these major world religions, it seems more and more that it's the norm for them to start out with a purely imaginary founder figure. And the exceptions are the ones that don't. And there's so much fewer of those than we suspect.
Yeah, just to clarify what I was saying earlier, I meant to say that when I meant by beginning is like the beginning of Judaism. Now I'm going to ask you about what you actually what is actually at the beginning of your timeline. So let's talk about the prelude to religion.
Sure.
From the first 2 million years.
Yeah. I made the deliberate choice of starting even before we were quote unquote human, because there's all these evolutionary advantages that just by being social animals we have inherited down the line. And people like Daniel Dennett, David Sloan Wilson have really brought out how these evolutionary survival mechanisms later down the line gets co-opted by religious movements, and that psychology, that theology comes out of some of these things. For instance, just for one, there's a thing called agency detection, which is that part of your brain that sees faces in the clouds and feels like there's ghosts in the room. It's detecting when there's another brain around. And the simplest example of that is it's safer for your brain to be wrong about a tiger that's not there than to be wrong about a tiger that is there. And so our brains are skewed to say, hey, what was that? Did something cause that? To tend to think there's things there that aren't there because it's safer than to ignore a real threat. Things like that. From there, the books go on to all the major evolutionary stages that not just the top 10, but all the world religions throughout time have gone through, according to the best way that we can reconstruct them through anthropology and through history. Talking about, for instance, when we were first humans, under the earliest hunter-gatherer societies, going from there to the shaman, from the shaman to the chieftain. As these social structures grow and get bigger and more inclusive and start including, when you go from chieftains to kingdoms to city-states to empires, at each one of these stages, the religion that's dominant takes on a whole new change and a whole new meaning. And there's really interesting processes that take place, to the point where you can almost say, hey, tell me about your God, and I'll tell you what level of society you come from. And again, all our major top 10 religions that are around today, they all seem to go back to a period within the first millennium BCE, and maybe even half that span of time. But it's a very interesting process to see the evolution of these and how they draw upon each other. How, for instance, monotheism came about not as just this 3-step from, polytheism to, from animism to polytheism to monotheism, but all these zigs and zags and this whole spectrum of different kinds of beliefs, different kinds of polytheism, different kinds of monotheism, that we find in history, and how these are all playing and can play at the same time through different parts of society. And we see that throughout the Bible, even though they try to make it seem like it was monotheism from the beginning all along. All the signs are theirs, even though they tried to, saw off the file off the serial numbers and hide it. You really can't disguise it very well. And they didn't do a very good job of disguising it. They keep making mistakes that give away the fact that this is the places we think of as Judah and Israel were polytheistic for a long, long time.
So what do things look like now that we go forward and we see we look at the last 50,000 years over the 2 million?
Yeah. As we jump in there, I mean, we go from the earliest forms of religion when we were hunter-gatherers is that they believe that everything has a spirit, the moon, the sun, water, earth, the rivers, the woods. And they believe in gods, basically any bigger thing than they are. But the most interesting thing about it is there is no religion. They don't worship them. Sometimes they even curse them and berate them and get in fights with them. But there's no middleman between people and the gods and the divine world. The supernatural world and the natural world are the one and the same for the earliest forms of religion, hunter-gatherers. Once we get, a few thousand years later than that, you start seeing specialists who start saying, oh, yeah, I can speak for the gods for you. You need to be healed. Oh, you need this thing taken care of. Don't worry, talk to me and we'll make it happen. And that the development of that kind of specialist that we call shaman, though there's many different terms for that period of that type of person, that is where religion really takes off. And when the shaman and the chieftain join forces or become one and the same, then you really see how powerful religion can be and how dangerous religion can be if you're a worshiper. Very inequitable for the most part. And the whole argument of is religion good or bad, as through the course of the book, the answer is yes, it's good and it's bad. And the religions that succeed aren't just the ones that benefit the elites. But if you don't have the elite creating the religion, or at least promoting the religion, you won't have a religion. If you don't have a religion that the common people embrace, and you provide some benefit, even if it's just a cohesiveness of society, a banner on which we all can join under, it won't succeed either. You have to have both those things. And that's great for a religion. That's great for a society, not always great for the worshipers and the people who have to live in that paradigm.
And what do we know about human sacrifice?
Yeah, there was a point where human sacrifice was huge in different societies. And for instance, the Aztecs are probably the latest and most well-known. And I go into some of the details about that. But in Polynesia, in Americas, in all around the world, basically, you have human sacrifice. An interesting thing about Judaism is Judaism, at least in our Sunday schools and in our religious education, we're constantly told, oh, God is monotheistic and he hates human sacrifice. And yet the Bible itself is dripping with all these references to human sacrifice that either he turns a blind eye to, or he gives you a way out of it by saying, oh, well, you can redeem your son. But let's not kid ourselves. You owe the gods your firstborn. And that's just taken as a given, even among the so-called monotheism that we see in the Bible.
So now I want to ask you about the chiefdoms.
Yeah. Again, so when you get to the point where it's not just a hunter-gatherer group of your immediate family or a few villagers, that's grown and grown, it grows into groups and clusters of clans, all underneath a major leader. And by that time, generally, there's the leader himself claims divine status. His rule is not just a man talking, he's a god. He's the representative of the god. He's descended from the gods usually. He has to be obeyed, and people are his complete slaves. They're slaves of the god, and he represents the gods. Therefore, you do everything he tells you to. Your life revolves around them. Everything we see in the technology of the time, every project, like making a canoe, building, going out for the fishing, annual fishing expeditions, all those things are wrapped in ritual and and they're very religious occasions, and they're all directly underneath the thumb of the priest and the chieftain, and usually those are often the same person, or at least the same faction. And again, human sacrifice is a huge deal at this time. In Polynesia, for example, there's some great quotes that we get where who gets sacrificed. It's prisoners of war, et cetera, and anyone obnoxious to the priest or the chieftain. And it couldn't be more plain who's in charge.
So now I want to ask you about your thoughts on the Zoroastrian religion. But actually, well, I'll ask you in between, because I'll say that for the next question. Because
Okay.
the formation of empires. Let's start with that.
Yeah. So there's a period that some historians used to like to refer to as the Axial Age, which is roughly the latter half of the first millennium BCE, around 600 or so, thereabouts, to around 100, 200, or just the year one. And this is a time when it's traditionally been regarded as this time when all these ideas pop up. And there's a certain usefulness to the idea, even though it's largely fallen out of favor. But I think it works for different reasons than they used to think it was. It's not that this is a time when these guys with great ideas, religious ideas, just suddenly popped up. It's a time when you start getting multicultural, cosmopolitan empires of people who control different languages, different cultures, but they're all underneath the same political leadership. And it becomes super useful for those in power to have one God, a transcendent God who's above us all, but who's like father to all of us, um, who binds all these different people together under a single religion. And so this is part of the interesting trends that you see at points in time like this, when you have all these different cultures underneath one leadership. Your gods tend to start being more moral gods. Earlier, in earlier stages, morality is not really part of religion at all. It's you're a small group, so there's no anonymous crimes to begin with. You're related to just about everyone you know. If you see someone you don't know, you try to kill each other. But as these clusters of societies get bigger and bigger, you get morality, you get this trend towards a God who's not just the God of the hills or the God of the mountains, but a God of everything and everyone. And it tends to be a single God, not a pantheon. These ideas, these processes start moving in an inclination towards monotheism. Yeah. I'll stop it from there before we go too much further down the rabbit hole.
And what are your thoughts on the Mesopotamian religions and their parallels to the Bible?
Yeah, that's fascinating, and that's something that's been really interesting ever since we discovered the Epic of Gilgamesh and realized, oh, our story of the flood comes directly from this, and there's no question about it. And the more we learn about places like Ugarit and Elba and all these other ancient libraries in Mesopotamia, the more we get a better picture of what Israel and Judah were coming out of, and Samaria for that matter. And we see the influences that they have on our Bible. You mentioned Zoroastrianism real fast, quickly before we go too far away from that. So during the Babylonian exile, Israel and then later Judah all fell under the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, and the Persians. Now, once in that succession, once the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, the Jews who were there became servants and were but they were part of a massive multicultural empire, and eventually they were allowed to go back and settle what had been their ancestral homelands. That seems to be the time when what we think of as Judaism really started, at the very earliest. And in fact, people like Russell Gmerkin and especially have pointed out that everything, and also Jonathan Adler, the Tel Aviv archaeologist, they keep pointing out that what we think of as Judaism doesn't seem to start until, at the very earliest, the Babylonian exile, but our scriptures seem to come even later still, in the 3rd century or the 2nd century BCE, about 1,000 years later than we've always assumed that those came from. The story of Moses, I get into that in the book because the story of Moses is fascinating to see how young it is. And again, the Elephantine Papyri really drives home the fact that there were major swaths of Jews, for centuries that had no idea about Abraham, Moses, Joshua, any of this stuff that we have in the first 5 books of the Bible. They took existing Mesopotamian Canaanite memes and, for instance, stories of Abraham, stories of Lot, stories of Jacob, all these patriarchs. In our Bible, it's all this generational saga and they're all related to each other, even though sometimes they're telling the same story exactly as happened to a different person. but it turns out that those probably, since they're, one clue of this is that they're all set in different areas, that these were different local gods or ancestor figures, and their stories became eventually folded into one long Jewish epic that we call the Deuteronomistic history. And that came even later than the Babylonian exile, definitely after the Babylonian exile. To go back to that, when we're in exile, when the Jews are in exile, eventually they're under Persian exile, not Assyrian or Babylonian exile. And that's the time when the influences between the Persian religion, which, as you said, was called Zoroastrianism, the influence of that on our Judaism are so apparent and so obvious and non-controversial to historians, by the way. They've always known that Zoroastrianism is the granddaddy of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That whole Abrahamic tradition owes so much to Zoroastrianism. I'm kind of surprised we don't call it, we don't normally include it when we're talking about the Abrahamic tradition. We would not have Judaism as we know it. We wouldn't have Christianity or Islam as we know it if it weren't for the things that it took from Zoroastrianism. And again, we can talk about that all day too. But I'll put a pin in it for now.
I'd like to go ahead and ask you about what aspects of Zoroastrianism do you think they borrowed from?
Well, I mean, it's obvious that they borrowed things like the idea of an afterlife. In the earliest parts of Judean history, they didn't believe in an afterlife. They believed in a heaven, but not for us. We didn't live there. Yahweh lived there, or whichever God you had in mind lived there. Everybody on earth, good, bad, alike, they all went to the same place, this gloomy underworld called Sheol. And that idea was very popular, not just among the Jews, but even among the Greeks. The idea of this gloomy underworld where everybody wound up. The Persians had a different spin on that. In Zoroastrianism, there was a good place, a good God and a bad God, and you went there depending on whether you were good or bad. It's interesting in the New Testament when Jesus turns to the thief and says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." He's using a Zoroastrian Persian word. Paradise comes directly from Zoroastrianism and Persia. And Adam and Eve, the idea of that, the eschatology of the end of the world, the ideas that demons cause diseases and ailments, angels and demons, the angels and demons of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam owe so much to the angelology of Zoroastrianism. And these are just the things that are coming off the top of my head. There's many, many more. And it's very hard for Christians in particular to deny the borrowings. And it is not just coincidental. Some of them, like the end of the world ideas, may have developed from each other in tandem because those came later. But there's so much that's clearly taken directly from Zoroastrianism that, you know, if Christians can't see it, historians certainly can.
So now I want to circle back to the Canaanite religion that I asked you about earlier.
Yeah.
How much does the Canaanite religion influence Judaism, from what you can tell, and in tandem with the Zoroastrian religion and the other religions that you talked about?
Yeah. When we talk about Canaanites, the Bible makes it sound like they were these, you know, evil proto people, and we drove them out, we the good people. But what that disguises is the fact that all the Israelites, all the Judeans, all the Sumerians, those were all Canaanites. They were all Canaanite peoples, which is why, of course, you know, we have verses like God talking to Moses and saying, "Oh, in those days I wasn't called Yahweh, I was called El, the Canaanite God." Lots of little slips like that and giveaways that they're trying to retroactively retcon the story to make it seem like it was always just the one God all the time. Even the story of the golden calves that we have that Ehrman makes, golden calf worship wasn't just part of Baal worship, but it was also part of Yahweh worship. And those sacred areas lasted hundreds of years longer than we get in the Bible. The Bible's constantly telling us that, oh, this and that good king got rid of all the high places, got rid of all the sacred poles, got rid of all the golden calf worships, and then they're back again when we have talks about other later kings. So it gets really painfully obvious that they keep trying to retroactively change the story in ways that they keep forgetting that they've already changed, and they just can't keep their story straight as far as that. But long story short, when you're talking about Canaanites, you're talking about Israelites and Judeans, and the whole conquest of Canaan is a complete fiction. The whole idea of there just being 12 tribes of Israel, complete fiction, and a much later fiction. There are many more tribes than just 12. And there was never a time when we had just 12 and for instance, there was never a time that we had a united monarchy of Israel and Judah either. These are all things that have been so ingrained in us from reading the Old Testament that we didn't think to check it archaeologically or to check the records of other neighboring kingdoms and see what they had to say about Israel and Judah. And when we do get archaeological collaboration for Israel and Judah, and by extension the Old Testament, it tells a very different story. And in fact, so much so that everybody from Abraham to, say, Solomon do not appear to have been real people. They seem to be fictitious characters made up centuries later by the authors of the Judaistic history. And there's a lot to unpack in that statement. I know that's a big thing to say, but that's the nutshell. And I spend a major portion of the book just pointing out how we know that's the case and steering you to other historians who can back that up as well.
And what do you think about the rivalry between Marduk and Yahweh?
It's funny because Marduk is one of the gods, Babylonian god, that could have been our one true God. And when I talk about the second part of book 1, the gods of monotheism, one of the things I make really clear is that it wasn't inevitable for our Yahweh to be the one true God, trademark. The god of Zoroastrianism, or Mazda, he could have been the one true God. And in fact, a lot of times when we're talking about our God, our Yahweh, you're using the exact same terms, exact same language, and exact same sentiments that we get from the Persian god, Ahura Mazda. Same thing with the Egyptian god, Akhenaten's god, Aten, the sun disk. Same with religions that we have as far away as India, and Assyria and Babylonia. There's all these gods who also could have gone on to be the one true God if politics had worked out slightly differently. And it's funny how what small hinges some of these great political upheavals and religious upheavals turn on.
And when do you see monotheism becoming grounded?
That's a tough question. Definitely for Judaism, by the time of the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, when you actually have scribes who are creating this global origin story, not a global, but an origin story for Judaism. The first 5 books of Moses are clearly trying to establish Yahweh as being the one true thing. I think from the time of the Babylonian captivity to when we actually have those scriptures written, that there was an ongoing feud between the polytheism in ancient Israel and Judah, and what's called the Yahweh alone party, that religious faction that wanted to make just one God, and they were clearly influenced by the time in Babylon and Persia. Again, we wouldn't have it if they hadn't come out of a Persian context. Yep. I keep biting my tongue. Is like, let's not start another lecture. Let's move on to other questions. But yeah.
I do want to ask you about because some will point out and I can see why that in the Hebrew Bible it's not really monotheistic, because you look at the Ten Commandments, and God says, "I'm a jealous God."
Yep.
Or as I asked you about earlier, Deuteronomy 32, Yahweh inherits Israel from another God.
Yep. Yep.
So you have passages like that that kind of make it problematic to view the text as being monotheistic at all. What do you think
Absolutely.
about that?
Yeah, absolutely right. And there's even different kinds of monotheisms. Like even when we have, uh, official monotheism, it's clear that it wasn't quite as cut and dry as we think of it today. Today, it's very clear what we mean by monotheism. I mean, there's only one God, only had ever been one God, and all the rest are just fake imaginary gods. But there were people who believed that, oh, every country had their own gods, and we were just happened to be, our Yahweh was our God, and not because of anything, that it gave to us. It was just we belong to Him because He's our God. And again, there was more than one Yahweh in different areas, and Yahweh Himself evolves from basically a storm god, just like Baal. It gets very hard to tell Baal and Yahweh apart in passages, and you can tell, for instance, that there's hymns and prophecies and declarations about our Yahweh that are clearly stolen from Baal, and they've just shaved off the serial numbers and turned a hymn to Baal into a hymn to Yahweh, or a hymn to El into a hymn to Yahweh. And again, even with that, we still see giveaway where they talk about El and talk about his sons, talk about Yahweh being a part of the council of gods, being the head of the council. If we want to get into Satan, and that's a whole evening's worth of talk right now, we can talk about how Satan was part of Yahweh's royal court up in heaven, and how Satan was not his name, it was his title, Hasatan, the adversary. He was like the prosecuting attorney for Yahweh. So these ideas of who Yahweh was and what he stood for are constantly in flux. They're constantly changing. And that's ignoring so many other gods that we had in Israel and Judah. Francesca Stavrakopoulou and I want to say John Barton have co-opted a great book called Religious Diversity in Israel and Judah, where they talk about how many different gods at different levels of society. You had people worshiping any number of gods and goddesses. In fact, one of the interesting facts is, like, during the 7th century, I believe it is, BCE, the number one archaeological find in that period is not something to do with the United Monarchy. It's not something to do with Yahweh. It's goddess figurines. It's the number one. We have hundreds of them from this one period. We have much more evidence for them than we do David or Solomon's kingdoms. Full stop.
So I'll take a couple of super chat questions real quick. Dr. Andy, thank you for your super chat. Great to see you, David. Like everything, what I have seen and heard from you, it's understandable and trustworthy at the same time. Much appreciated.
Thanks so much. I super appreciate that, Dr. Andy.
Hi, Fish and Ty, thank you for your super chat. Ahmed and Muhammad are titles for Blessed One. When the Quran uses them, could these be references to Isa? Is there real evidence Muhammad ever existed?
Oh, those are great questions. In a nutshell, let's break that down a little bit. Yeah, absolutely. The name Muhammad can also be the title. They both mean blessed one. Just like the name Jesus means Yahweh saves, just like the name David means the beloved one. All those three names can also be titles, and they all seem to be titles. When the Quran uses them, so much of early Islam, and don't put a fat one out in me, beautiful Islamic Muslim listeners out there, but everything we see in early Islam seems to be taken from heretical Christian sects in places like Syria, where the Quran itself, and again, we could spend all night talking about just that. The Quran seems to be taken largely from what we would call heretical Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, and to a certain extent Judaism. And they've taken those writings that were originally about Jesus, and they've turned him into a prophet of Islam. But they've also taken things that are directly assigned to Jesus and to Yahweh, and turned him into something said by Muhammad about Allah. Yep. Again, biting my tongue because I don't want to run down every rabbit hole too much, but I talk a lot about that in book 3. Probably half of book 3 is all about not just the creation of Islam, but the creation of the Quran, and what a weird scripture that is, and how there's problems with the Quran that even Muslim scholars don't have a clue. They're no wiser than we are about what this is supposed to mean, why these magic letters or numbers are here, what it means. Only Allah knows. And it makes no sense logically. There's no logical progression through the Quran. It's slapdash, and you have to have a whole plethora of etc. of not just hadith, but sayings of Muhammad, but commentary on the Quran, or it makes no sense whatsoever. And even so, even with all that and all these traditions behind it, there's still major portions of it where even the mullahs and the imams have no idea what it really means and which is the real meaning of this. It's mind-blowing. It's really it's one of those things that made me want to run out, stop working on the Sex and Violence in the Bible book, and write this book, because there's been so many really interesting work. Stephen Shoemaker's book, Creating the Quran, and Sean Anthony's book, Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, are two of the newer books that are really just blowing the doors wide open on early Islam. Now, to be clear, neither of these guys comes out and says, oh, there was no Muhammad. They're sure there was a guy named Muhammad. And yet, both of them make it abundantly clear that everything we think we know about Muhammad and early Islam and Mecca and the Arabic conquest as presented in early Islam, none of that happened. It's important to note that we tend to say, because it's encouraged by Islam itself, to say that Muhammad is the inspiration for the Arab conquests, and that was rooted in history. Therefore, Muhammad was real and led to this. The truth is, we had Arab conquests caused by the fall of Rome and the fall of Persia, leaving a political vacuum. And again, this is super short version of a very long story. But the Arabic conquest came first. Then generations later, 50 or 60 years later, then Islam comes about. 100 years after that, 200 years after that, you could not do anything in Islamic society unless Muhammad had said it first. But for the first 50 years, 60 years, there's nothing like that. There's a huge howling wilderness where Mecca, Medina, and Muhammad are supposed to have been. And everything we know about that story of the early Muhammad makes no sense historically at all. Archaeologically, historically, textually, theologically.
So my final question, I want to ask you about what you see going on between Baal and Yahweh.
Yeah, I keep coming back to the fact that as much as they hate each other, and the wars of brothers are the bloodiest, as they say, it gets very hard to tell them apart. And I think there's so much that, despite them being, completely opposite in the Bible, it's very clear that they are basically the same God or versions of the same God. Baal, after all, just means Lord. There's that. It's another case of the name just being a title. And it'd be really, I don't know how we would be able to parse that out now, but it's already interesting given what we do know about things in the Old Testament that clearly look like they applied to somebody else first. For instance, passages in the Song of Solomon that are clearly not about anything. They're not about Jesus and the church. They're not about God and his love for his people. It's a sexed up love poem, probably about a god and a goddess that have nothing to do originally with the Jewish religion or the Christian religion. Hey, baby cat, don't jump on that. You're going to tear the whole thing down. Come here, you monkey. All right. Sorry about that.
No problem. And so I just want to remind everybody that David's book, Playing God, is in the description below. So you want to go over there and purchase it. You click for that link. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, David.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate anybody who wants to buy the book. If you like to buy an autographed copy directly from me, find me on Facebook or shoot me an email at everybodylovesdave@gmail.com. I'm happy to make that happen. And I'm really excited about these 3 books because they pack a huge punch, each one of them. It's really cool stuff. Enjoy.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.